Welcome to the series titled Assessing On-Farm Produce Safety Risks, Production. This module is part of a series to assist you in creating a food safety program and preparing you for a gap audit. These videos are based off a series of 7 fact sheets available through Virginia Cooperative Extension. Today, we will be discussing the 4th step of developing a food safety program, addressing the production stage of your operation. During production, it is important to identify primary routes of contamination from biological, chemical, and physical hazards. Once these hazards are identified, practices that reduce the likelihood of contamination or risk should be implemented. There are several important factors to consider: soil amendment types, application methods or timing, and storage practices. Wildlife, livestock, and domestic animal presence, intrusion, and monitoring, water sources, quality, uses, application methods, and water system construction and maintenance, agricultural chemical uses, mixing, application equipment, storage, and disposal practices, waste handling and disposal practices. When considering the risks associated with the soil amendments you are using, you first want to identify if they contain any materials of animal origin, and if your soil amendments are treated using a process such as composting. You will also want to consider how you store your soil amendments and the necessary records that need to be kept. Untreated animal-based soil amendments include the following in this list, and can include any amendment that has been mixed with raw manure. All of these cases do not involve a controlled, scientifically validated treatment. These types of amendments can be a source of human pathogens, so it is important that food safety risks are understood, and the amendments are handled, applied, and stored properly in order to avoid product contamination and cross-contamination. In order to avoid product contamination, it is important that you identify practices that will reduce this risk. This includes training employees who will handle untreated amendments on special hygiene practices related to clothing, boots, gloves used when handling, and how to handle machinery, equipment, and tools used to move, haul, and apply the untreated amendment. Untreated amendments should be applied at a minimum of 120 days prior to harvest. Careful attention should be made in terms of when amendments are applied, the application method, and whether the amendment will be incorporated. In order to avoid runoff, never apply amendments to a saturated, frozen, or snow-covered field, or during strong winds and heavy rain. Also consider if there is increased risk of runoff when using a surface application method rather than an incorporated method. Workers applying amendments should be cognizant of a potential cross-contamination or spread into an adjacent field or irrigation source. Untreated animal-based soil amendments should never be applied directly to the harvestable portion of the crop. Treated animal-based soil amendments are those materials that have undergone a controlled process, generally composting, that follows a scientifically validated process that follows a designated time at a specific temperature followed by a curing stage. If treated amendments are purchased, it is important that you are aware of the ingredients and that you have documentation of how the materials were treated and a proper certificate of analysis is provided. Regardless of the type of amendment you use, it is important that soil amendments are stored in a manner so that they don't contaminate produce or equipment, and that they are protected so they do not become contaminated. Soil amendments should be separated from the production and packing areas and away from any water sources. Treated and untreated amendments should be stored separately so treated amendments do not become contaminated. It is important that records are kept for soil amendment treatment, handling, storage, and application. Records should include worker training, the type of amendment that is used for what crop, the application periods, the treatment that was used, or a proper certificate of analysis, cleaning and sanitation of tools and equipment, and any corrective actions in the event of cross-contamination events caused by runoff events or contact with contaminated tools or equipment, overspray, and treated and untreated amendments that may have commingled. Wildlife, livestock, and domestic animals can be a biological hazard and a source of pathogen contamination to fresh produce. It is important to assess the various risks that animals pose on your farm in all production settings. A good place to start would be to consider the production fields and all adjacent areas, including physical structures, land features like bodies of water, wooded areas, and roads, and other agricultural use sites. Though we are focusing on the production stage, the same principles apply to the other stages of your process. When considering the risks related to wildlife, it is important to consider that wildlife need places for shelter, water, food, and protection. Use your knowledge of your farm and your operation and think about where animal activity is likely to occur. You also may consider the activity patterns of the animals or night intrusion. Consider wooded areas around fields that may provide an ideal habitat and protective cover for deer and birds, while your produce fields provide food. Think about ponds used for irrigation purposes and if they are used by waterfowl year-round. It is also important to think about outdoor coal piles, trash receptacles, and structures. Rafters in barns, sheds, or packing houses present a nice place for birds to nest. You and field workers should familiarize yourself with the appearance of wildlife, tunnels, and scat, or feces. You should implement a monitoring or scouting protocol and document what is seen. Once you have identified potential risks, it is important to develop a strategy to reduce their presence. Generally, control measures focus on deterrence and exclusion. Deterrents usually include things like predator decoys, noise machines, live traps, and nuisance kill permits. The measures usually have limited effectiveness over time, so it might be useful to use multiple approaches or rotate measures when needed. Exclusion includes things like fencing, netting, and actual enclosed structures. With all of these measures, there are pros and cons in terms of cost, effectiveness, and feasibility. Before you use any wildlife control measures, especially traps, baits, poison, chemical repellents, and hunting permits, you should consult the proper local, state, and federal regulatory bodies to ensure that measures are in line with legal guidelines. In the previous module, pre-plant, we discussed identifying livestock adjacent to food production fields. It is not uncommon for farms to be diversified with mixed operations of produce and livestock. It is important to consider exclusion measures like fencing out livestock from produce fields and irrigation sources and having an adequate buffer zone to prevent runoff into fields and water sources. This buffer zone is extremely important for poultry houses to reduce airborne dust from ventilation. If your farm uses working animals like a draft horse, it is important to avoid the production areas when harvestable portions of the crop are present. There should be protocols in place on how the animal and manure is handled in the field. Pets also can carry and transmit human pathogens, so it is important that they are always restricted from production areas. If you have frequent visitors to your farm, such as a U-Pick, agritourism, or an on-farm market stand operation, adding no pets signage would be important. Any animal entry event should be documented along with the corrective actions taken. Agricultural water and water distribution systems can be a source of contamination for human pathogens on fresh produce. Assessing the risk associated with water and water systems are critical to minimizing produce contamination. Factors that you want to consider when assessing the risks associated with the water and the water system include the source of the water used for agricultural purposes. These include surface water, such as ponds, lakes, streams, and rivers, ground or well water, and municipal water. Production uses, whether that be irrigation, cooling, or spray application of fungicides, the type of irrigation method used, which include drip, overhead, and furrow systems. And if you are using a water treatment system like UV light, chlorination, peracetic acid, or ozone. Some of these factors are inherently riskier, like using surface water versus well water, and may require more control measures. Addressing these factors will help in identifying the potential levels of risk and possible control measures you can take moving forward. Similar to the activity we did in Module 1, hazard analysis, we will want to sketch the general layout of your water system and the flow of water. Include features such as irrigation source, pumps, backflow prevention devices, treatment equipment, and other above-ground features. It is also important to include the delivery system as well as the delivery lines, water captured for reuse, irrigation sprinklers, and application devices. It may be helpful to take photographs of these devices to go along with your sketches, especially those that have a permanent fixture on the farm. Remember, this sketch can be done by hand and does not have to be fancy or technical. After you have created your map, consider your water sources and make a list of specific uses for each source. Your sketches and uses list will help you develop your water management plan, which should detail your policies and practices for frequency of water source testing, application methods, and water system inspection and needed repairs or maintenance. All surface water and groundwater sources should be sampled and analyzed to determine the total coliforms and generic E. coli in your water. During the active growing season, all surface water sources should be tested. Refer to the fact sheet of this module for the number of tests needed for your water source. Groundwater should be tested at least once during the growing season. If you use municipal water, you can request a copy of the municipality's water tests or the certifications of quality for the growing period of interest. It is important that you document how you sample the water, when it was sampled, and include the test results as part of your records. Be sure to develop a corrective action plan if water tests are positive for high counts of E. coli. Further description of potential corrective actions can be found in the fact sheet that accompanies this module. Agricultural chemicals such as synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, cleaning chemicals, equipment lubricants, fuels, and sanitizers can pose a risk of contaminating produce and/or harming employees and personnel. In order to assess the risks associated with the chemicals on your farm, create an inventory of the various products you use on the farm and during production. Be sure to include the label instructions and safety data sheets. It is also important to make sure that all applicators are trained and licensed and application equipment is properly cleaned. Be sure to document the application along with the mixtures per label requirements. It is also important to properly store chemicals in a separate location from production materials and properly dispose of unused or empty containers. And as always, have corrective actions in place to deal with spills or potential chemical contamination. All farms produce waste from their operation and facilities. You should assess all your waste streams and manage them appropriately in order to avoid them from causing cross-contamination of produce or food contact surfaces. Once you have identified all the waste materials, you will need to develop standards of how waste will be handled in a manner to avoid contamination. In order to avoid attracting pests or rodents, temporary waste containers and coal bins should always be emptied throughout the day, when full, and at the end of the day. Trash receptacles should be provided at each toilet or sanitation unit, hand washing station, designated eating and break areas, and inside any indoor facility. Outdoor trash receptacles and dumpsters should always have lids and be located away from production areas. You have now completed this module. There are some important steps you should complete before moving on to the next module. You will want to make sure you review the production fact sheet found on the course site or on the Virginia Cooperative Extension website. There you will find more in-depth information on the topics we covered in this module, along with supporting resources and documents. At the end of the fact sheet, you will find a checklist that will help you implement the topics covered in this module. Completing it will help you prepare for the requirements of a gap audit. Along with that checklist, you will want to develop your control strategies for the concepts discussed in today's module, which include soil amendments animal exclusion, agricultural water, agricultural chemicals, and waste management. Once you have completed these steps, you should be ready to move on to the next module in this series, Assessing On-Farm Produce Safety Risks, Harvest Stage.